this fourth and last session of the Ocean Decade Vision 2030 series of webinars that are meant to gather inputs on the Vision 2030 white papers that have been produced in the last months from 10 working groups and the co-chairs and the members of the working groups. I'm Nicolas Bassan, and I'm Science Officer at IOC UNESCO, and I'll briefly introduce the agenda for today, and then I'll leave the floor to Alison and the speakers to bring us in the contents of this webinar. This is session 4, an inspiring and engaging ocean for all, that will focus on challenges 9 and 10, capacity development, ocean literacy, indigenous and local knowledge, and cultural heritage. These are the foundational challenges of the decade, on which all the others challenges actually are based on also and need and have huge needs in terms of for developing and achieving the challenges. Please note that this webinar is recorded, and we can move to the agenda. We'll briefly go through a welcome and overview of the meeting objectives and agenda, a rapid presentation of the Ocean Decade objectives, outcomes, and the Ocean Decade ecosystem, the introduction to the framework of the Vision 2030 process, and of the 2024 Ocean Decade Conference in Barcelona with its program. Then we'll deep dive in the core of the webinar, so the challenges. In this case, the presentation will be of the 2 challenges and the expert working groups, and the overview of the white papers and the review surveys. At the end, we'll leave 30 minutes for Q&A and discussion piece. These will be the occasion from the audience to ask questions and give inputs on the white papers and the contents of the white papers, and interact with the co-chairs. So please, in the meantime, please feel free to go in the Q&A box and type any question and inputs that you would like to share. Then we'll have the closing remarks with key takeaways and the wrap-up, and the next steps in the Vision 2030 process. So please feel free to provide any inputs in the Q&A session, in the Q&A box, sorry, and I'll also ask to the panelists to start looking at the Q&A and the comments that arrive and start replying to those. But for the time being, I'll leave the floor to Alison for the welcome and overview. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicola, and lovely to see you all here this morning or this afternoon or this evening, as your time zone may dictate. This is the last, but certainly not the least, of the 4 webinars that we've been doing. As Nicola said, the 2 challenges that we're talking about today, I mean, all the challenges are important, but these really are some of the foundational challenges to the decade. So it was very fitting not only that they're together, but also that we're discussing them at the end of what has been a fantastic week of discussions about the white papers and about the Vision 2030 process. We've been having, we've been starting to see from the very first webinars this week how common themes and common synergies and issues are arising, and I'm sure many of those will be consolidated and discussed further today. So if we can go to the next slide, please, and I'll just give you a brief introduction about, well, I guess the objectives of the webinar, although Nicola has already described these very well. But what I wanted to point out here really was that this whole Vision 2030 process, which started, I mean, the idea of it started probably about a year ago now, has been from the outset designed as a very participatory process. We really need to do this with the Ocean Decade community, with people who are not yet part of the Ocean Decade community. But the only way that we're going to get the rigor and the richness that we need through this process is through participation. So these webinars have been essential to that, and I'll come in a minute to some of the milestones and how the process has been rolling out. But just to say that we wanted to have these webinars in parallel to a more formal written review process of the white papers for the Vision 2030, because we felt it was a way to get perhaps less formal, more, more participation and more input from a broader audience. And I see we've got a really good number of participants online. So I think we're well ready to get some good feedback, because it's very important that we have all different voices in this process, so that we can ensure that the outputs coming out of the process really reflect that diverse view of ranges. So if we can move to the next slide, and this one is sort of starting to underpinning, or just some reminders of how the decade is structured, and therefore how we came up with this whole Vision 2030 process. So I think many of you will have seen this graphic before. It is more or less the theory of change of the ocean decade, where we're moving from the ocean that we have to the ocean we want. And we're doing that obviously through the very rapidly growing ecosystem of ocean decade actions. We now have around 50 global programs, close to 300 projects that are working at the local, the national, the regional scale. We have numerous contributions, hundreds and hundreds of activities that are going on. And the way that we have structured the decade, so that we're not just having a dispersed amount of energy and activity, is around the Ocean Decade challenges. So these were developed in late 2020 as we were putting the implementation plan for the decade together. And they really are, or at the time, were the most immediate and pressing needs for ocean science and ocean knowledge to support sustainable development, which of course is the essence of the decade. And they were really designed as sort of the pillars of action of the decade, if you like. So all of the decade actions, the programs, the projects, activities, contributions, before they become part of the decade, have to tell us how they're going to work collectively with other partners to contribute to one or more of these ocean decade challenges. So they're really fundamental to the structure of the decade and to generating and galvanizing actors around collective action and impact. And the theory of change then goes that if we're meeting these in a collective way, these most pressing issues and priorities, then we will have a significant contribution to the 7-decade outcomes, which are really the characteristics of the ocean we want in 2030. And you can see those outcomes listed there on the right-hand side of the slide. So as we've been going through the decade, we're getting pretty good now at being able to tell the story around the actions. We know what's happening with the actions. We can report on their progress. We can say what is happening in terms of achievements, where there are some gaps, great numbers about diversity, numbers of institutions, people, early careers involved in these actions. So that's all through the monitoring and evaluation framework, and we're able to measure and track progress on the actions. On the outcomes at that higher level, the more aspirational goals, we're also tracking progress through an IOC UNESCO-led initiative, the State of the Ocean Report, which is a periodic report that comes out that in a narrative style really tracks and monitors progress and evaluates how the world is moving towards these ocean decade outcomes, including the contribution of the decade. But what we're not yet doing in the decade is at the level of the challenges. We don't yet have that end goal for the challenges, and therefore we're in a quantifiable and measurable way, and we're therefore not yet tracking progress and evaluating and self-analyzing how we're moving towards the achievement of these challenges. And that is exactly where the Vision 2030 process comes in. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So the Vision 2030 process was very deliberately not something that was developed at the outset of the decade. At the outset of the decade, we very much wanted to create this bottom-up movement, the momentum, the energy, this portfolio of decade actions, and have people get their ideas underway and active and happening. That we have now achieved. But what we now need is to take a lot of that energy and momentum and use that as the foundation to create this common vision and this common pathway to the strategic ambition, to the final end goal for each of these ocean decade challenges. And that is what this process is trying to do. In very simple terms, it's trying to say we've got all of this activity happening in the decade already, but how do we want to build on that? What is still missing? and what does success look like for each of these Ocean Decade challenges? So that's the first question. How can we say that challenge number 10 around behavior change and cultural values of the ocean has been a success? How are we going to measure that? And then what are the milestones and the indicators that we need to be tracking along the way so that if needed, we can course correct, we can add new priorities, we can refine, evaluate, analyze as we go along. So that is the challenge of the Vision 2030 process for each of the Ocean Decade challenges, to set this strategic ambition, this measure of success for the challenge. And it's not just about the science, it's not just about the knowledge, it's about the partnerships, the technology, the resources, the capacity development. So it's taking a very holistic view of what success would look like for each of the Ocean Decade challenges. So if we can move on to the next slide. The way we've done that has been through the dedicated hard work of many, many, many individuals. So we have over 150 experts who have voluntarily given up their time, as well as the support team from IOC, UNESCO, and partners. And a huge, huge thank you to all of our co-chairs and our working group members, their tireless work over the last few months. The way we have done this is set up 10 working groups, 10 expert working groups, one for each of the challenges, of course, that are made up of very diverse representatives of different sectors, of different geographies, genders, generations. And these are individuals that have been selected not only for their individual expertise, but also for the networks that they have. So they can already start to be bringing in some of these different perspectives and this participation into the process. And essentially, each working group has been charged with preparing a white paper. And so the zero draft white paper is what is currently out for review and that we'll be talking about today. And in addition to the work on the white paper, the co-chairs of all those groups have also been talking and will continue to talk, including in person starting next week, to make sure that we're getting the linkages across the Ocean Decade challenges so that we're not creating new silos, but that we're making sure that challenges such as Challenge 9 on capacity development and Challenge 10 on behavior change really can play that foundational role. We're not there yet. We still have work to do, but we want to have different steps in the review process so that we can incrementally have feedback, improve, refine, put it back out there, get more input, and continue to evolve the white papers, which are really this statement of the strategic ambition of each of the Ocean Decade challenges. So if we can move to the next slide. So the milestones in this are, we're currently in the very first sort of public review phase of the zero draft white paper. So these are these interactive webinars plus the written survey, and I think we'll have the link in the chat for that. The aim is that based on all the feedback that we're collecting through those two streams, we are going to be working starting from next weekend when we'll be meeting in New Orleans to develop a version 1.0 of the white papers, as well as a synthesis report that tries to draw out already some of these linkages, common themes across the challenges. These version 1.0 white papers plus the synthesis paper will be brought to the 2024 Ocean Decade Conference, which will be held in Barcelona from the 10th to 12th of April in a little less than 2 months' time now. And they will really be a central or the central piece of that conference. And I'll come to a slide on that conference in a moment to explain a little bit more how these white papers fit in. But really, that is the moment where 1,500 in-person participants plus a virtual audience are going to be able to look at version 1.0 of the white papers, the synthesis report, and give even more feedback so that after that conference and hopefully before the middle of the year, we can come up with version 2.0, which is more or less the final version of the white papers, which of course doesn't finish there because the white papers have a series of recommendations and have a series of actions, which will then be built out and put into operation, particularly over the next year, 2 years, and leading to the end of the decade, but in line with some of the other big milestones also that are coming up in the global ocean calendar, such as the United Nations Ocean Conference in Nice in 2025. So you see these white papers are really part of an entire process that will continue to live and continue to grow over the remainder of the decade. So just very quickly on Barcelona, and then I'll hand over to the co-chairs because I know that's what you really are here to listen to and to react on. But the Ocean Decade Conference in Barcelona is one in a series of conferences that will happen every 3 years. 2021 was the kickoff. It was, well, I mean, it was still a great event, but it was online because of COVID. So this will be the first in-person gathering of the Ocean Decade community. We're very excited. There's still a lot of work to do to get us all there, but we're in very good hands with our hosts in Spain, and we're pulling together an incredible program, of which, of course, these white papers and the Vision 2030 process results will be central. So the conference is really about taking stock, celebrating achievements, and setting a common and shared vision for the rest of the decade. And then one more slide on the conference to show you how we're going to do that. You'll see this is the conference is actually part of a whole Ocean Decade week. So for those of you who are coming to Barcelona, who are traveling to Barcelona, do try and be there for as much of the week of the 8th of April as possible, because on the 8th and 9th, there are some incredible satellite events that will really set the tone for the conference, including some wonderful events that I know are being planned on ocean literacy and many of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. The main conference is then from the 10th to 12th, and you can see here these 4 sessions that are in coloured text. So these are the core scientific, technical knowledge sessions of the conference, and this is where, in a mixture of plenary and parallel sessions, we will be presenting and then discussing the version 1.0 of the white paper, so the next version after this current review round, with the aim being that we get a lot of feedback, a lot more buy-in through these sessions that can then be fed into the conference outcomes and taken to the next stage of the process. So Barcelona is a critical moment. We've had huge demand to be present. If you have requested registration and haven't heard back yet, I would just ask you to please be patient. We hope within the next week everybody will have heard back, but just to let you know, we've had over 5,000 requests for registration for 1,500 places. So it has been quite a task to go through those in a very large Excel spreadsheet and try and make sure we have a very diverse audience in the room with us. And if we're not able to be confirmed as attending, there will be certainly live streaming of many of the key sessions and ways to participate. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Hopefully that gives you enough context. And now I'll hand back to Nicolo, who will hand over to our fabulous co-chairs, but I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation and see how it's building on the conversations that we've already had this week. So thank you all for being here. Back to you, Nicolo.
Thank you very much, Alison, for showing us and presenting the Ocean Decade ecosystem, the framework of the Vision 2030 process with its timelines, deadlines, and the fact also that the white papers are living documents, and so the next steps will be to gather as much feedback as possible from the broader community in general on the contents of these white papers, and also, of course, for showing us the details of the Barcelona conference. But let's move on to the core of this webinar. So starting with Working Group 9, focusing on Challenge 9, Skills, Knowledge, and Technology for All, which aims to ensure comprehensive capacity development and equitable access to data, information, knowledge, and technology across all aspects of ocean science and for all stakeholders. The 2 co-chairs of this working group are Brian Arbic, a professor of oceanography at the University of Michigan, and Eden Mahu, senior lecturer of marine biogeochemistry at the University of Ghana. I know Brian is here with us today, so please, Brian, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah. Can you hear me okay? So yeah, I'm a professor of oceanography at the University of Michigan. I'm in a broad earth science department. I'm a physical oceanographer. As you might imagine, Michigan, because it's not on the ocean, doesn't have a huge number of oceanographers, but a few. I'm actually in California now, working with NASA collaborators. It's pretty early in the morning. Next. So just to start a little bit with process. I was going to mention that Adam and I have worked together on our own capacity development projects since 2015. We run a summer school in Africa, in case you're interested how we know each other. And that's kind of growing every year. And so a bit about process. So here are the pictures of the other expert members of our working group. You can see there's a diversity of ages and genders and locations. So we do have people from Africa, Asia, and the US and Europe and elsewhere. And so we have met as a group many times over Zoom and written the white paper just like all the other groups have done. I guess one thing I'll mention before I get into the next bit of slides, I completely agree that Challenge 9 is foundational for the rest of the decade. So my own view is something like this, that what I have found is that a lot of times one will be in a meeting, a Zoom meeting usually, but also in person, of scientists, and they'll say something like, oh, in order to achieve this, we need to have some oceanographers from Africa or some other place that's not as well represented. And people will say things like, does anyone know an African oceanographer? I've actually heard people say this many times. And so my own view is that in order to change this, there just has to be far more programs that bring people together just so they meet and work on common problems, because oceanography is a global science. So you need to take measurements and do models and talk to policymakers everywhere. And, I think we all know from statistics that if you look at representation on important panels or publications in journals, that it's very skewed towards what you might call higher resource nations. So we're hoping to change that. So next slide. So I apologize for this. I kind of totally scrambling to get ready for the ocean sciences meeting next week. So we didn't have time to come up with very nice visuals, but if you look at the white paper, we have a lot of tables like this, needs and priority issues. Of course, I won't read all the words, but you can get the idea. So amongst scientists, as I just mentioned, some of the concerns or needs, representation, again, career opportunities, publication opportunities, funding, things like that are very skewed towards higher resource nations. People worry about getting jobs. I mean, obviously everyone needs a job. And so in many parts of the world, it's not so easy to get a job in marine sciences. Observation and laboratory infrastructure is really lacking. We see this all the time in our summer school in Ghana. People like Edom, for instance, for many years, she was a lab-based scientist, didn't have a lab. So in order to do her lab work, she had to visit collaborators elsewhere. That's changing, fortunately, but that's the kind of thing people face. Internet is often really poor. And, we sometimes don't realize how important that is. And having good internet, it's just essential for doing scientific work. And there needs to be more international partnerships. And I think all these things are changing. So priority issues, it's a really long list. Disparities have already been mentioned. Unequal distribution of funding. A lot of countries don't have things like a national science foundation like the US has and the UK has NERC. Many countries don't have that. So where do scientists go for funding? They often have to go to sources abroad or foundations. There's a technological and digital divide between the global north and south, and limited access to data. It costs a lot to publish open access articles. That's another issue. And I already mentioned underrepresentation. So next slide. So that was the list for scientists. So for resource users, individuals and communities, this could include, for instance, groups like fishermen. So knowledge about the state of ocean resources and sustainable resource use, skills in waste management, technology and infrastructure for sustainable resource use, education and awareness for how important the ocean is. I mean, I find it's kind of interesting as a physical oceanographer whose work is climate relevant. Even people who are quite scientifically literate don't even realize that the ocean is actually part of the climate system, an important part of it. And I find that true amongst, scientists, much less the general public. So I think the importance of the ocean is something that needs to be communicated across a broad spectrum of society. Meaningful participation in decision making. So, you know, if pollution is happening in the area, or overfishing, do citizens have any say about ways to combat that? Community actions. So my favorite personal story on this is, you know, one of our participants at our summer school has started a NGO to combat plastic waste on the beaches in Ghana, which is a really bad problem. So priority issues for resource users would be things like best practices in resource use and protection, better access to policymakers, and things like that. So next slide. So for educators and communicators, some needs are more digital and media literacy, and access to best practices in education. So for instance, in some of the places we work, people are used to kind of rote learning. And so actually hands-on learning is not always such a common practice as you might think. And so people just coming to learn more about computer programming and things like that are really valuable in modern science, you know, and doing it in a hands-on way, we find this is something that people really enjoy and they don't see as often as they would like to. Cultural competence and awareness. So, you know, there I would say that personally, I think part of the value of bringing scientists from higher resource nations to under-resourced nations is just so they can see with their own eyes the challenges that people face in under-resourced nations. Like, what is it like to try to do science when you're lacking laboratory equipment and internet? You're seeing it with your own eyes, really, the challenges they face and being in different cultures is really valuable. So priority issues, well, you know, limited educational resources. So do people have the opportunities to get the degrees they want and the jobs they want? That's always a huge issue. Language is another issue that, you know, I'm a typical American. I speak English and that's it. And, you know, so sometimes we forget that there are many languages out there. And so that's another issue that I personally constantly have to be reminded of. Next. So managers and policymakers, again, do they have a basic knowledge of ocean science? That's always an important question. Do they give access to scientists to help them, you know, give them information on the marine sector and the challenges that the ocean faces? Knowledge of international laws and agreements. So I guess things that like law of the sea. You know, we had a big working group write this, so I don't always remember every bullet point what someone was thinking about. So another thing would be systems for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of policies. So, you know, if someone implements a policy to clean up the ocean, then that involves science because then people have to monitor and see if it's succeeded. So some priority issues for managers and policymakers. Again, I think limited knowledge about the importance of the ocean is a constant theme. And inability to resolve conflicts amongst different resource users. That's a common one, of course, you know. And limited knowledge of global ocean equity. You know, just do people realize how incredibly skewed the resources are, funding and otherwise? Next. So some specific objectives of the strategic ambition that we've come up with. I think if you push the next button, they start rolling out. Yeah. So, you know, here, I think just to summarize all these things, you can read these and of course, more importantly, read the white paper, but just try to address all these things, like in an ideal world, like just taking the second to last bullet point, everyone who's doing good science should have access to funding, and countries should actually invest in. It says here invest in ocean science, but I would actually say invest in science in general. So I personally spend most of my time thinking about these things in Africa, and a lot of influential Africans that I know think that the most important thing that African governments could do would be to just simply invest, 2% a year of their budgets towards science in general, so that their scientists could write for funding. And I think that some African countries are doing that, but it's a pretty small fraction, as I understand it. So encourage more partnerships. There's lots of groups that are trying to bring scientists from higher resource and under-resourced nations together to work on common challenges. Another one is innovative fit-for-purpose solutions. So, sometimes it's not the best idea to buy really expensive equipment, but rather to come up with creative ways to make good measurements at low cost. So that's the third to last bullet. So anyway, these are the kinds of things just jobs, funding, representation, all of those things. So the specific objectives would be to try to get ocean science to a state where these things they're clearly not being met right now, but just try to get it closer to an even playing field. Next. So some desired outcomes going along with that, is more people out there with the kind of skills needed to be ocean scientists, degrees, jobs. They know how to do research at a high level and have networks with the rest of the world, so that they can work together with scientists all over the place. Representation has been mentioned many times. Equitable access to data and knowledge and resources, funding, and so forth. And yeah, okay, next. Okay, so I'll just say one last thing, that I personally think that our white paper as it stands right now, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will. I think it's a little bit generic, so it's kind of like we all know there's these problems, and we know the kinds of where we'd like to head, but we probably need to be a little more specific about things. And we got this comment from the IOC, forget what it's called, but there's an IOC group that Alan Evans is on, and we met them a week or two ago, and they were kind of saying, tie together different decade actions and groups of experts, and so just give more specificity in our white paper. Right now, we kind of have a lot of generic statements. So I think I will just admit, personally, I think that's how we have to improve the white papers, make it a little more specific. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian, for your honesty, first of all, for being very early in the morning where you are right now, but also for showing us the work that you've done together with Edem and all the group during these, in understanding which are the main aspects of the challenge, but also the gaps with which you had to work, identifying also the priority issues and the user needs in terms of capacity development in general as a cross-cutting team for all ocean science sector in general, and identifying the elements of the strategic ambition and the key desired outcomes from the white paper. And also, again, that these are living documents. So, of course, this is the zero version, the zero draft, and we'll move to a more structured draft and include any elements that are currently missing in the next period. If you would like to start answering some of the questions, I see there's one in the Q&A. Of course, feel free, and then we'll catch up also later. Feel free to answer in writing, and then we can catch up later at the comment section. Because now we'll move to the next working group, which is working group 10. focusing on Challenge 10, change humanity's relationship with the ocean, knowledge and technology for all. The scope is to ensure that the multiple values and services of the ocean for human well-being, culture, and sustainable development are widely understood, and identify and overcome barriers to behavior change required for a step change in humanity's relationship with the ocean. The two co-chairs of this working group are Des Glitero, National Lead of the Canadian Ocean Literacy Coalition, and Nicola Bridge, Head of the Ocean Advocacy and Engagement of the Ocean Conservation Trust. I know both of you will be speaking today, so I think Des will start.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Nicolo, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to join this webinar. Both myself and Nicola, and on behalf of the entire Challenge 10 working group team, we're really excited to just have the opportunity to hear your comments, questions, and input. We love that this is called version 0, because it really is first attempt. So let's move to the next slide and get rolling here. In terms of the working group, fabulous team, a real privilege. I think both Nicola and I feel to have had the opportunity and continued opportunity to work with everyone on this list. And despite being a very diverse team of social scientists, educators, communication experts, people from cultural institutions, and philanthropic and private sector, you know, there's also artists and writers and people passionate about surfing and diving. So there's a really amazing team of people, as well as ECOPs, early career, and individuals from the Decade Advisory Board, as well as some of the regional collaborative centers. So a great mix. But one thing we recognized as a team early on is there were a lot of voices. Like, despite the diversity, there were lots of voices still missing. And so we really tried to hold space for that throughout the process, and certainly through this review process and going forward. Next slide, please. You know, in recognizing those voice gaps too, we wanted to make sure, as with all other 9 challenge teams, to try and make this, you know, this Vision 20 effort as participatory as possible. And 2 things I just want to draw attention to is we recognized as a team that we were absolutely not starting from scratch. There has been so much incredible work done over the last, you know, 5 years and more preceding the decade itself that looked at kind of ambition setting, forward thinking, people-centered approaches to the question around changing humanity's relationship with the ocean. And just as a few examples, you know, Sea Change Project, or Responsible, or the Future Seas 2030 project more recently in Australia. So many bright spots. And beyond just these collaborative efforts and ambitious setting efforts, there was always a lot of work too done within research, interdisciplinary research, bringing together, you know, environmental psychology, behavior change, social, marine citizenship and social science, as well as looking at science communication, social marketing. So we're able to draw on so much work. And that was really kind of the first chunk of our few months working together, is what's already been done, what's been identified as kind of key actions, recommendations, priorities, gaps, and let's build from there. And then the second thing just to draw attention to was around just the input gathering. And so each of the working group members really took on a lot of opportunity to reach out to peer networks and workshops and try and gather prior to the writing of the white paper. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of, you know, keeping in mind 2030 and keeping in mind to set a strategic ambition that's not so much aspirational, but one that can be achievable, operational, and measurable. And so that was kind of the guiding thinking we went into it. And we were able to quite quickly and so far consistently, you know, land where we have, and really Challenge 10. It's all about the motivation, right? It's all about people. It's all about relationships and behavior change. You know, how do we create those enabling conditions and the environments and supports needed that really will help people change their behaviors in ways that will ensure a healthy ocean? Next slide, please. And so when we're looking at who you know, and the word user groups came up, but we often as a working group would change that user to think about enablers and movers. Like, who are those people that could really build those cultural, personal, emotional connections with the ocean and work with society to really help catalyze those connections and provide the inspiration and motivation, as well as the opportunities and access to be part of this groundswell of change that's required across all scales of society. Next slide, please. And as we're moving along, there was a lot of kind of foundational context setting, like anchors we wanted to kind of ground the white paper in before we got into the actual, here are the actions, recommendations, and how we'll measure progress. And at the same time, we also were trying to keep in mind that we wanted this white paper, and I'm sure all white papers do, but I think this one in particular, we felt the responsibility to make it as accessible and readable as possible. And so we did opt to try or attempt to kind of take some of this foundational thinking and context setting and put it into visuals. So, you know, certainly one thing we're looking for is, as readers of these first draft of the white paper, like, are these visuals and early schematics helpful, or are they just noise? So we'd love to hear any thoughts around that. But in terms of this initial kind of conceptual framework, which really does anchor, I think, the thinking of the white paper, is that we wanted to put ocean health, our central goal, right in the middle, and recognizing that the ocean, it's a living ecosystem, it's with its own rights. And that as much as the decade's about kind of the sustainable management of resources, ocean resources, it's also about our collective responsibility to manage our behaviors in ways that are in the best interest of the ocean. And so, and moving outwards, looking at the other 9 challenge areas, knowing that challenge 10 intersects with all of them, and the role that those 9 challenges play in kind of achieving the biological health and societal health that we need. And then the 4 drivers that we've identified, and anchoring those to the social foundations, which are, you know, the cornerstones of people's sense of identity, well-being, and really ensuring that we bridge that ocean human health connection. Next slide, please. And I think along with that conceptual thinking, there was also a lot of attention and discussion, and certainly intention, to the best of our abilities, and certainly grateful for the leadership of Ken Paul on our working group around bringing Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking and knowledge systems into Challenge 10 discussions. And so this is, you know, as Ken wanted me to reiterate, definitely very much a working diagram. But the idea that, you know, often so much of the decade community, we're focused in on that top dimension around the mental and then the knowledge systems, and even with attempts to have a more integrative science approach with the physical sciences, social sciences, Indigenous knowledge systems, that has to be countered and balanced, you know, and grounded in more of the emotional and in societal needs and touch points, as well as the cultural connections, and then collectively ensuring that the action we need to happen does happen. So real balance across these 4 dimensions is needed. Next slide, please. And knowing that so much about Challenge 10 was around, you know, motivation, like in catalyzing, inspiring that motivation to drive people to want to take action. You know, we recognized right at the start of first meeting as a working group on so many levels, we already know what we need to do, but we're not doing it. So what are the barriers? What are the enablers? What are the motivators? And this slide here, certainly it's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but rather kind of a sampling of what we gleaned from existing research, as well as peer workshop discussions and input. Like, what are some of those things that have been identified around barriers, enablers, and motivators, so that really can help us shape the drivers and the actions that will help us get to our strategic ambition. Next slide, please. And this will be the last slide I touch on before I turn over to my fantastic colleague. Couple things just on this one. You know, all that initial framing helped us kind of land on what we think are the 4 drivers. But again, input would be really it's really important to hear at this early stage. In terms of knowledge system, just a couple of things we want to touch on. I've already noted in that earlier diagram the idea of that integrative science and the need to ensure that the physical sciences, social sciences, Indigenous ways of knowing are integrated, but also communities, science that co-developed, co-designed with community from the start. And then adding another layer to that is those experts, the educators, the communicators, the artists, the storytellers, those people that have the ability to bridge science with those kind of personal, emotional, motivating, catalyzing that we need to help to ensure that the science is kind of anchored in people's relevancy in daily lives in locally relevant and culturally appropriate ways. And so I think that is kind of the approach to science that we really need. Communication, the one thing I just wanted to note on that level, I mean, I think everyone recognizes it as an essential driver, but was really exciting to see is a parallel process was already underway with the ocean communication community self-organizing already, identifying their kind of strategic ambition for 2030. What are the key actions? And so we've taken that parallel work and integrated it right into the key actions that we see under this driver in this first draft. So really nice synergies there. With education, just the one thing to note, it's always identified as being so important, yet always kind of underfunded and undervalued in the sense of like, it's a nice to have, but near the end. And it is so key. The other thing we wanted to draw attention to is that when we say education, yes, there's the formal education K to 12, but also thinking it lifelong, you know, from cradle to career and beyond. So all those public spaces where intergenerational families and just the public gather. And those are spaces for learning and engagement and activation. And also drawing attention to that education does not equal ocean literacy. Ocean education is the driver, ocean literacy is an outcome. It's a society that better understands, values, and cares for the ocean. So making that distinction. And lastly, the cultural connections, just how we know that our relationships with the ocean are different. And they're shaped by history and culture and race and power and privilege and many dimensions, and being mindful of that as an important driver. Over to you, Nicola.
Thanks, Diz, my fantastic colleague. That was a nice thing to say. So yeah, it was really nice to hear Brian being really honest and quite emotional about his challenge too. So just from that point of view, I think, you know, we had some difficult times with this. It's so complex. What we're trying to do here is so complex. The ocean is complex and our relationship with it is complex. So how do we even begin to change humanity's relationship with the ocean? So what we had to try to do is get really practical. Okay, we've got our drivers. So if I could have the next slide, please. What we then needed was to really focus. So for each of our drivers, what we really wanted from the collective of our working group, and then with the socialization we did of our drivers, what are the key actions? Who enables the actions? What do we need to do these actions, and how can this be measured? And so we kind of sent that out into our networks. These are the drivers, but how do we make them real? What do we need to do? So for the next few slides, I'm going to talk you through kind of the overarching actions that we came up with for each of those drivers. So if I could have the next slide, please. So these aren't in any particular order. So we'll start with knowledge systems. So really, the key point here is that if we really want to change humanity's relationship with the ocean, we have to change what we see as evidence around that and around science as a whole. So at the end of the 10 years of our ocean decade, as a community, we need to have held each other to account and to be doing that last line in the first paragraph. Our community is championing the sharing of knowledge in multiple diverse ways. And we're not just saying it, we're actually doing it. And, you know, that's what Diz was kind of saying earlier. This is about action, about doing things. So we are saying here, this is the thing that we need to work on together and hold each other to account for. And then the actions underneath that priority outcome, just as a kind of boil them down, we're really talking about funding again, as Brian was saying. Diz has said it earlier as well. So if we really want to ensure that we recognise the evidence and the data that is not just from a traditional Western science mechanism, funding is going to be required for that. And then also, you know, often when we think about ocean science, you can kind of think about the types of science that we would all be traditionally thinking of. And so really we want to say that social sciences as well are as equal within the decade of ocean science as the sciences that we would normally associate with protecting the ocean. So the next slide, please, is communication. So there is a saying that kind of goes around, which I quite like, which is conservation is behavior. And I've also heard recently the saying that conservation is communication. So if we really want to look after the ocean, communication is not kind of the thing that we do at the end. We need communicators in the room at the beginning of our decade programs, actions, projects, so that we're not doing this amazing science in a bubble. So really, those three key actions that we've put underneath our priority outcome there, again, if you boil those down, what we need is communication for communicators. Our communicators need to get together in groups and then get that out there to the people that need it. And we're not just talking about other communicators, we're talking about scientists, educators, policymakers, the media. And as Diz said, it's brilliant that there's going to be a 2-day session on this at the conference in Barcelona. Next slide, please. Which is education. And again, just going back to what Diz said, this isn't about starting again with education. This really is about strengthening what we already have. There are some amazing ocean education networks out there, some fantastic ocean educators. It's incredible. But I think that we, within kind of the ocean field, are still in this kind of knowledge deficit model around education. If we educate people, they will change their behavior. And we know that that's not true. You can pass as much of your amazing ocean knowledge out of your head into somebody else's head, but all you've done is just given them more knowledge. What we need to do is move our education from just passing on knowledge from one person to another to really thinking about those physical connections with the ocean, the emotional connections to the ocean, and using that to inspire the further learning and understanding, and then how those two things can be stuck together so that people have the emotional connection, the understanding that drives the motivation for them wanting to change. So education is really important, but we've got to move away from those traditional kind of passing on information models and then thinking that we've changed behavior just because we've told somebody something. And then the final, well, not the final, the final driver, not the final slide, the final driver is cultural connections. And then this, you know, really came about because very, very early on, thankfully, because of our amazing working group, you know, discussion one, we knew and realized that not everybody does have to change their relationship with the ocean. You know, changing humanity's relationship with the ocean makes you think that's everyone. But there are out on our planet, on this beautiful blue blob in the middle of this sky, space, there are some cultures that really do know how to live with the ocean in a way that is equal, that doesn't harm it, and that keeps it in a sustainable fashion. So how can we not copy those cultures, not appropriate those cultures, but how can we learn from people that do have a better, positive, kinder, respectful relationship with the ocean, and how could we use that information, that experience to help others to act in the same way. And then finally, our milestones and indicators. Thanks very much for moving the slide on. So all the time when we were talking about Challenge 10, we did this with our hands. We were, oh, it's really massive, but it's really small. It's about individuals. It's really far away, but it's really close. So our milestones and indicators, we've gone for short, medium and long term to try to help us again to just get that practical head on with what we want to do. So one of the most important things, and we had to stop ourselves almost from doing it within our working group, is that we need a theory of change. So we're saying change humanity's relationship with the ocean. The drivers are a kind of a key moment in time that we can embed into our theory of change, but we really do need to do that piece of work so that we know exactly what the steps are from now to the 10 years, so that we have this changed relationship. I think, or we think also, that there needs to be more of a descriptor on what that looks like. How is that changed relationship shown? And then moving down to sort of the last moments, the long-term milestones, 2030 plus. As Alison was saying, you know, what does success look like? So for us, we think it would be further funding, programs and research that are including social science and including this evidence from other knowledge systems, from other peoples that are not normally included in our work. And then, yeah, cultural norms, policies, just bringing up ocean literacy, marine citizenship at the 10-year mark, that we can see an increase of. So yeah, I think that's it. Our final slide just includes our emails, I believe, so that might be useful. But that's where we are with the white paper. It's not perfect. There's bits that are missing, I'm sure. So yeah, we would really like to hear thoughts and how we might improve it so that it resonates with as many people as possible.
Thank you very much, Nicola, Diz, for this wonderful presentation, for mostly dissecting the main elements of such a complex topic and challenge. I can just imagine how that could have been difficult, but also for showing us the multidisciplinarity of the challenge and of the topic, the best practices that are out there. So also looking at what is already out there without reinventing the wheel, and actually trying to connect the best practices and good initiatives out there. But also the priority user groups, such as cultural, regional, and emotional connections also, that are the foundations of this challenge, and the pro-ocean behaviors and drivers, the priority outcomes that you identified, and the key actions. And then, of course, to say that this is a living document, so we're more than open to any inputs and feedback from the global community. We will move to the Q&A and discussion section. There are a couple of guiding questions here that could help the audience provide inputs on the white paper itself. But I've also seen there were a couple of questions that have been answered in the Q&A box. But I also invite the attendees to provide any comments and questions during these 20 minutes that we have to discuss with the panelists. I think one question that could be both for working group 9 and 10 would be how the two challenges could support bottom-up initiatives in general, especially in SIDS and LDCs, for collection of data, for also local governance of local ecosystems. How do you think the two challenges could help bottom-up community approaches be really effective and sustainable over time? So whoever from Nicola, Diz, or Brian would like to speak, please jump in.
Well, if I can make another honest comment, one thing I worry about a little bit, and I'm pretty sure other groups do too, we have a pretty strict page limit, and so there's kind of only so much information that can be put in a short document. So I think it's pretty easy to say, oh, you should talk about this and all these other things, and you know, we could write 100-page paper if we addressed everything. I don't know if the other co-chairs kind of agree with that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and thanks, Nicolo, for that question. I mean, some of the, we were chatting too in terms of that bottom-up approach is, you know, even though there's some common actions that have been identified and potential pathways kind of moving forward, there's no one approach, right, in terms of what this is going to look like. And so I think that the thought is for us really, when we look about some of the key actions as identified in the white paper and looking ahead to the operationalizing of that, is it has to be done in a really decentralized regional way, so that that these different actions can be carried out in locally relevant and meaningfully place-based ways, but that we're working towards the same actions. Just how we go about it is perhaps done differently, and then being able to bring that that the progress using similar kind of indicators of measuring progress together, and to see kind of, you know, how we're moving along between now and 2030. So it's a great question. I mean, we don't have an answer for it. We're just thinking about that bottom-up approach in every facet, from the operationalizing to the measure, and how do we do this?
Thank you very much, Brian. I think a couple of comments coming in are regarding the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, but I'm also sure, because there's the example of the Quilombola populations in Brazil, but I'm also sure that besides Indigenous knowledge, there's also local communities knowledge and minorities knowledge, and so that's included within the broad framework of the white paper on how we can encompass all this knowledge and integrate all this knowledge. That's another thing I would say, and it's in the broader scope of the challenge. Yeah, well. And another question that was for challenge 10, it's and I think this comes also from the paper. There's some suggestions for this. If one of the actions that could be done also worldwide would be to create this global network. There are many, we know there are many regional networks on marine social scientists, of marine educators, of ocean literacy. Could that be one of the actions in the near future, to actually have a global network talking about Challenge 10 and connecting different experiences from all over the world?
I think that's a great idea. I think for me, what this is my opinion. These white papers are a moment in time where Nicolo and Alison and Ord and everyone, you have gathered together a set of sort of, if I'm allowed to call myself this as well, global experts on the specifics of those challenges, who have also then connected their networks and their networks and their networks who are feeding in. So I almost kind of feel these white papers are like, you could call them the advice papers, and the the collection of all the stuff that's already happening papers, because you know the field of ocean connection and ocean science is huge. There's so much going on, and every time you hear about something, you hear about another thing and another thing. And I think that's, you know, through our white paper, that's what we really wanted to say. We're not starting from scratch. There's so much amazing stuff. We asked our working group to put into a Google Drive all of the, you know, their favorite reports and toolkits, and it's full. It's absolutely full. So I think that's how I would hope that people would read these papers. And, you know, we're setting the scene for what needs to happen moving forward, and it's for people to kind of pick the parts of it that speak most to them, and then we the new way of working and the new way of bringing in these different voices. You know, one group does it, then another group does it, and then they share that example, and it grows that way. So I feel like I've lost the train of thought that I was going for there, but that's how I'm seeing it. So, you know, we're putting out there best practice basically, for others to use.
Thanks, Nicola. I don't know if you want to add something, but I see there quite a number of comments also for working group 10, such as the first one, which was related to one of the drivers, cultural connection, that it's mapped against a specific user group. So it was asking, why is it mapped to that specific user group? But that's, I think, a prioritization that you've done in the white paper concerning that specific driver within the challenge. Is not a unique relation between that driver and that user community, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, Nicolo, I think you're right there. And Wilhelmina, thanks for that question. And I'm wondering if it ties in a little bit with David, your question, and if it doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but both of your points are really important. I just can't listen and type fast enough. So I will follow up more, and I know Nicolo wanted to. But you know, David in particular, you know, with your comment there around yeah, could there be less emphasis, or there needs to be less emphasis on the behavior change and more of the radical integration of the local knowledge. And, you know, and with that local knowledge and the cultural connections, I think that's the tie with Wilhelmine. And I think, you know, you've raised a really good point and potentially a different approach, and very much appreciated. I think when we, again, it's so hard, like how so many voices, so much input. How do you package it? Like how do you frame it? I think it could have been done in so many different ways. We were mindful, you know, when you hit send on that first ground zero draft, it's like, yeah, you know, should we have done it that way? And I think you're right, that is one of the central things of Challenge 10 is that integration. And when we looked at, and maybe we lean too much of putting all of that into what we, you know, term knowledge, like multiple knowledge systems. And we were, when we put that, like it was thinking that truly integrated science that, and clearly we didn't word it well enough, but the physical sciences, the social sciences, Indigenous knowledges, the local vernacular kind of place-based knowledge that's rooted in that those intergenerational and kind of cultural connections, because all of that has to be integrated together from the start of any research, together with the communicators, you know, that can ensure that it sticks. The integrated science and the outcomes and the findings and the knowledge sharing sticks at a community level, in you know, very in all aspects of communities. I see comments too around rural communities, and yeah, a tall order. I mean, we're still working through, but keep adding comments because it will allow us to take this and would love to follow up with you after. I see, Brian, your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly mention two things. The first bullet on the right-hand side, have the links with other challenges been identified? So I was just going to say, here's an example of something where our group could be a bit more specific. And I went back and looked up the group that we meant. It was the IOC group of experts on capacity development, and we agreed that that's one thing we should do. One of their suggestions that they had is, you know, instead of just saying that in order to address pollution or biodiversity or anything else, you need to have capacity development. Just instead of saying you need capacity development, to actually link it to the other challenges. That's what I meant to say. To say, for instance, if you want to do a better job monitoring pollution, you need more ocean scientists. And so that's a capacity development challenge. And so, as has been mentioned a few times, I think capacity development challenge 9 kind of is central to all the challenges. If you want to meet this or that or the other thing, you need more equitably distributed capacity. And I also just want to say again, I think it was Nicholas said, you know, funding is so important. I completely agree with that. I think any of these things you want to do require funding. I think that should be emphasized again.
Thank you, Brian. And this, yes, and also adding up to what this was mentioning in the paper, it's identified that it's not necessarily needed to change completely the relationship with the ocean of humanities, but actually restore or modify, since some of the cultures and communities around the world have a very good relationship with the ocean. So we need to also take inspiration from those. Another question is that if the white paper of Working Group 10 took into consideration the Ocean Literacy Action Plan, and I suppose so, since I think you, Diz, and Nicola have been involved in this. So maybe we can directly reply like this. And if it could be good, of course, to invest in existing initiatives, well, best practices in general, to scale those up and invest in the people that are currently engaged and spearheading capacity development efforts, capacity sharing efforts around the globe. So focusing the resources in the best practices actually out there, and then eventually also trying to support the establishment of new initiatives. So I think that's a straightforward point. And then I can see there are many comments arriving, so just give me a second. I see some are currently replying regarding Indigenous people. How did you reach out to Indigenous people? How did you involve them? How were you able to involve Indigenous communities and voices within the work? Yeah, this question to Nicola and Diz eventually.
Go, Diz.
Thanks, Nicolo, very much, and Gloria for the question. Yeah, in terms of work challenge group 10, we had, one working group member that identified, self-identifies as Indigenous, and from Woodholton First Nation in Atlantic Canada. And and so with Ken's perspectives shared, and as well as that diagram created, it wasn't just built on like one individual's. It was, Ken's work with Indigenous communities, both domestically in Canada as well as globally. I think, there was opportunities to kind of pulse check this kind of, thinking and ideas, and getting a sense of, what resonates, how does it fit. We're also looking at a lot of the work done by different Indigenous. So for example, Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, and the concept of two-eyed seeing, which we integrated into the paper, and that need for integrative science, and so taking existing Indigenous-led research recommendations, best practices, and trying to integrate that into the thinking that was looking at behavior change and motivations, and each of those driver spaces, like within education, not just looking at the existing and emerging initiatives that are happening, but also trying to look at it from different lenses. So what the thought leadership within Indigenous education and reconciliation education, and how does that intersect with global citizenship education, and ocean climate education. So trying to look at it, trying to pull in these different, and absolutely, Gloria, we need, when we talk about missing voices, or like, there needs to be a lot more, much more engagement. So there's been talk of we're working with a Indigenous graphic facilitator who's currently has the first draft of the white paper. And she's reading it and creating kind of a visual representation through an Indigenous lens of what she sees when she reads that paper, what she sees kind of as the strengths and gaps. So trying to go out about it in different ways, but any suggestions, drop them in the box, because we know we got a lot of work to do and need to do better.
I think you said the word earlier, Diz. It's relationships, isn't it? It's building relationships across the board with everyone, and not seeing this, we're very transactional a lot of time. This is what I'm working, I need this thing to be done, I'm going to find somebody that can do that and they can do it for me. But actually, I'm always saying, if we want to change humanity's relationship with the ocean, it's about our relationship with the ocean and also with each other, and just being authentic and kind and fun and friendly, and let, if somebody makes a mistake, it's okay. So I don't want to get too emotional myself, but that's part of the part of the culture, I guess, that we're talking about as well. At the end of the decade, are we going to see our community supporting each other? And Diz says a great word, that braiding in of all of these different types of knowledge and backgrounds from all corners of the earth. But yeah, it's human relationships with each other and the ocean, which will contribute to the end goal.
Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow up on that word that Nicola just used, relationships, because of course I think capacity development, a lot of it is about relationships between people. And one thing that I think is really important that I didn't mention before is that a lot of people's experience is that it requires a long-term relationship. So I think sometimes people think, like, let's go have this one meeting one time and gather people together, and it's kind of what people would call a one-off. And I think that real change requires people to meet repeatedly, just meet again and again and keep working together. And I have found personally that, sorry to keep using my own personal examples, but if you go to, like, when I went to Ghana and met the chair of ocean sciences, he basically said, oh, you Americans, you tend to just come in, meet us once, take the measurements you need, leave, we never hear from you again, you write a paper, our names aren't on it, and that's it. And I think you have to break that cycle and go back again and again and build up the relationships over years. And I think that's what leads to meaningful capacity development, as well as, well, everything, not just capacity development. And then on another technical point, I was just wondering, there's a lot of great points being brought up in the chat. So a question for Nicola, are you saving all this so you can send it to us so that, I responded to one person, yes, this is a great point, I'll bring it to the working group, but if you sent us the text,
Yes, of course.
it's easier to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Of course, thanks, Brian and this Nicola. To right away respond to you, Brian. Yes, we will collect all the comments and inputs that are arriving from these webinars and from the formal review process, and we'll then provide those to all the co-chairs and working groups to actually integrate those in the current version of the white papers. There was also a comment regarding the safeguarding in general of small-scale fisheries and national cultural connections to that, and I think it connects very well to the right holders aspect within the ocean. So besides the stakeholders, who are the right holders for that specific space or resource, and so also to the connection and the need to protect cultural and the traditional ways of using the ocean in general, and that goes also together with a question on equity, on equitable share of the ocean resources and the services it provides, and how we could feed this within policy making, and how can we monitor that this is respected in general. And that's a very good point. There were many other comments. I see some are currently being answered, and I would say that we can collect some of the last comments coming from the audience at this point, but in the interest of time, and also to let the co-chairs go, I would like to start the wrap up. First of all, let me thank the co-chairs. Sorry, Brian, you wanna say something before the wrap up, please?
Yeah, very quick point. I don't think we put our emails, me and Adam, on the presentation. Someone's asked for them, so if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, we can eventually share those in the chat with everyone, so that you have the emails of Brian and Adam, and so that's sorted. So as a start of the wrap up, and then I'll leave the floor to Alison. I would like to thank all the co-chairs and all the attendees for being with us, and during these 4 sessions we managed to talk about all the challenges and all the white papers. It's a first step of this interaction and feedback with a global community, and this will keep going. But again, I would like to thank the co-chairs, the attendees, and all the team that supported this. So without further ado, Alison, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Nicolo, and thanks to Brian and Nicola and Diz for fantastic presentations. I mean, I've read the white papers, of course, but hearing you present them brings so much more life and depth, and so it was extremely useful for me as well. And I look forward to continuing to discuss them. And you know, as I said at the outset, we did hear things here that no, actually, before I go to that, what I wanted to comment on Brian's use of the word generic, because I fully understand the challenge that both of these groups had, and to an extent, groups working on data and observations as well, that in an ideal world, we wouldn't have done this process in parallel. We probably would have started off with the first 5 challenges and already got them working and thinking, and then had that discussion around. So here are some of the knowledge gaps for biodiversity, for marine pollution. Where does capacity development come in? Where does ocean literacy come in? Ideally, it would have been a process that was sequenced differently. So we fully understand that challenge, and fully understand that we now need to do that work, essentially. And one of the things, of course, we're going to try and do in New Orleans and in other online meetings is try and, I think, address some of those comments and questions and make those linkages. So we fully understand the challenge and don't see that as a weakness, but just a reality of the way in which the process has happened because of the timing. And then I wanted to come to, yes, commonalities that we are seeing. And Nicolo and Ord and I have had the privilege, maybe of being the only 3, but I'm not sure. I'm sure there were others as well, who have been able to participate in all the webinars this week. And we are seeing some of these same issues coming up, which is, I think, very reassuring as well, because it means we can find common solutions in the framework of the decade rather than a challenge by challenge approach. And some of these are around that sort of that global south versus global north, that regional versus national versus international, the questions around Indigenous and local knowledge and how we bring local communities into these discussions. And I think one thing that's been particularly interesting for me, and I don't know, maybe for others in the coordination unit, or maybe they weren't thinking the same thing, but when we first started this, I was thinking, okay, so this is going to help us scope future calls for decade actions. That's where the bulk of it's going to be. And I'm actually seeing that a lot of it is around, it is future decade actions, but it's also the enabling pieces around that. And so it's the networks that we need to create. It's the the knowledge exchange and sharing mechanisms that we need to create. It's the capacity we need to create. And not all of that is just going to be new decade programs or new decade projects. And of course, funding is fundamental to all of that. So I think it's really, I mean, it's helping us really, which is what, you know, these discussions are intended to do, broaden our perception of what, even further, what that strategic ambition is going to be. So I loved, I can't remember now if it was Nicola or Diz who said that these papers are a moment in time, and they really are. And I really think we need to think about them like that. This is a process. The decade is going to continue to evolve and to refine itself right till 2030, and we hope beyond for many of the sort of the legacy projects and initiatives. So we are putting our thoughts on paper at a moment in time, as we did in 2020 when we first wrote the challenges. So we need to keep that in mind as well. These are never going to be something that's going to be tied up in a little bow and says, that's it, that is the definitive piece of work on that particular challenge. It is a starting point. And just as you've all built on analyses and work, and we heard this yesterday with observations as well, all the work that's been done by communities around the world with this sort of thinking, this also adds to that mountain of knowledge and that mountain of discussion. And it is an essential piece of that, both for the decade and more broadly. So those are just some reflections. So thank you again. Next key milestones, if people want to get involved in the process. So the 22nd of February is the date that the written comments via the survey. So there is an online survey that you've seen in the chat. So if you do want to make written comments on one or more of the white papers, the deadline for that is the 22nd, which I believe is next Thursday. If you are at Ocean Sciences meeting in New Orleans starting next week, then on the 23rd of February at, I think, 12:45, we have a town hall on the Vision 2030 process where you will get to see Brian and Diz and myself in person talking about this. So it's a relatively short session, but it is a moment to have some in-person contact and have more exchange and talk about this. So if you are at Ocean Sciences, please do come and see us and join that session, if nothing else, just to meet in person. And then, of course, the next big one to mark on calendars is the Barcelona conference, 10th to 12th of April. Registration for that has already closed, of course. And as I said, if you haven't heard yet, please be patient. You will hear one way or the other very, very soon. And if you're not able to come to Barcelona, we'll also be, of course, letting you know how you can participate virtually. But we aim to have we hope all of our co-chairs with us in Barcelona, leading the different plenary and parallel sessions on the white papers and leading the discussion. So if you're there, you'll be able to interact with them in person as well. So with that, I see we're getting very close to the half hour. So again, huge thanks to Nicola and Ord for pulling together, not only coordinating the whole process over the last few months, but pulling together these webinars. We've had fantastic attendance at all of them. And as I say, it's been a very rich experience. Thank you to the audience for being here, for listening, for the excellent comments, and a huge thank you to the co-chairs. The work is not over yet. So I'm thanking you for the work done to date and the work to come in the future, but we really couldn't have done it without you and the working groups that you've so ably and tirelessly led over the last few months. So look forward to seeing some of you in New Orleans, and then many more of you in Barcelona. And have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, morning, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.